All right, welcome everyone. We are going to get started. So look, I know you're not here to hear me speak. I'm not either. So I'm going to take up very little of your time so we can have Elspeth tell us all about trees with nuts. I am so excited. Tonight, this is one of my favorite series called Sustainable Brunswick. And it is a joint effort between amazing volunteer presenters who are willing to share their knowledge. Woohoo! And it's amazing because we live in this awesome community where we have those really knowledgeable, amazing humans who are willing to share their knowledge. So, yay! And then us at the library who get to host you, so thank you. And then, of course, the town who has an amazing sustainability plan and is working all of this on all of these topics, so wonderful. So it's been a really fruitful series, and we do a program each month, and I was thrilled when this program came to be. And how it came to be, you may wonder, because some of you I recognize, because this is now the third acorn processing program we have run at Curtis Memorial Library. And so we try to do this every few years. But never before have I had someone with a published book on it, and even better, a published book that came to me that said, hey, might you be interested in this? And I literally squealed in the office and said, oh my gosh, the nut people are coming to us now. We don't have to beg them to come. So thank you for making my dreams come true on that. I'm so excited. This is such an important topic and so very relevant to our communities in Maine. And I'm just really thrilled that not only you're here tonight to share your knowledge, but that then I can recommend a book later. So that's wonderful. For those of you who are wondering, we do have copies of this book on order, but there's also ones here tonight that you could purchase and take home. So, even better. Immediate gratification. With that, we are going to get started. Just a quick note, the library, you may notice, is closed. We had a fluent leak this morning. You're totally safe here, but the rest of the library, for everyone's health and safety and the smell, we kept closed today. We were planning on reopening tomorrow. There was a huge group effort, again, by wonderful community members to get it up and running, so it may look a little different, but we'll be there to serve you and get you those books. And anything else, and your acorn nut wizards if you need them after tonight, which you may, as part of our library of things. So once again, I'm going to turn it over to Elspeth. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here. Can everyone hear me? All right. So we are going to do a few different things tonight. I'm going to give a brief 15-minute talk. I'm going to answer a few questions, if you have any. And then we're actually going to do some actual acorn processing together. You're going to have a chance to get your hands on a few different ways of processing acorns. Everyone has their own preferred technique, and so I want you to be able to try out a few different ways. And then I'm happy to stick around and answer more questions, because the number one thing I have found about talking about acorns is that people have a lot of questions. So yeah, that's what tonight's going to look like. And while I am talking right off the bat, just in case you're staring at the table, there are two different families of oaks here, and we'll talk more about those later. So something to think about while we dive in. So first of all, thank you all for coming. My name is Elspeth Hay. I grew up in Brunswick, right on the Harpswell line. And now I live and work on Cape Cod. So it is a nice pleasure to be home amongst all of you back in my hometown. And I am here today because I am obsessed with the fact that acorns, can you still hear me, are edible. And I know that some people might be wondering why acorns, although the fact that you're here speaks volumes about your interest in acorns, but lots of things are edible, right? Lobster rolls, blueberries, hot dog buns, there's a whole long list. So why acorns? What is so exciting about this food? And learning that we humans can eat acorns actually profoundly changed my life, and I think it can change yours too. And so that is the story that I want to share with you over the next 10 or 15 minutes. Raise your hand if you've ever felt a little depressed or panicky about our current industrial food system. Okay. So the biggest thing that I hope you walk away with tonight is a feeling that it doesn't have to be this way, and that there are ways of eating that can really upend that relationship that we're stuck in right now. So I work as a reporter on food and the environment with the National Public Radio station on Cape Cod, and I've been doing that for the past 15 years, and the conversations that I've had over the past 5-ish years about nut trees and the other species that they coexist with, and their history and their potential have been by far the most exciting and hopeful conversations that I've had in my whole 15-year career as a food and environment reporter. So as we're here kind of imagining the world we want to create and live our way into, I want to throw into the mix a vision of a food system that is centered on our keystone nut trees. So that's oaks, chestnuts, hazelnuts as staple foods. And this means that they would be everyday crops like corn or rice or wheat, which might sound a little far-fetched. But in fact, I think it's one path to a thriving future. So first I'm going to tell you how I came to believe this. Then I'm going to tell you why these trees are so powerful. And finally, we're going to talk about what can happen as we get back into relationship with these species. So first, let's dive into how I came to believe so strongly in the power of these trees. I grew up with these fine parents over here. They are bird watchers, so they watch and study birds. And I spent chunks of my childhood being carted both willingly and unwillingly around the state of Maine looking at birds. And everywhere we went, we would talk about how the birds were perfectly adapted to the ecosystems where they lived. So I learned about sapsuckers, how they drill these neat little rows of holes into trees. We learned about crossbills, which have mandibles perfectly adapted for extracting seeds from conifers. And then we would go home and we would stop at the grocery store and we would get our food there. And, this was the same store stocked with food from industrial farms that I knew were destroying the same ecosystems where these birds and other wild species lived. And to me, it seemed like we were the one species that didn't really have a habitat and the one species that didn't really fit in with the natural world. And I don't think I could have articulated it at the time as a kid, but I found this really devastating. Based on everything I heard and learned, it seemed like the ecology of the living world around us would be better off if we weren't there. And again, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you've ever felt this way. Okay, so I'm not alone in that feeling. So I grew up and moved to Cape Cod, and I now live in Wellfleet, which is almost to Provincetown. We do this on Cape Cod, so I'm like out here. And I live in the heart of the Cape Cod National Seashore, which is about 45,000 acres of protected land, mostly oak and pitch pine forest. And when you ask yourself who it's protected from, the answer is us, right? So I got a job reporting on food and the environment and working with my national public radio station. And I'd been doing that for about 10 years when a friend sent me a video of a TEDx talk by a woman in Greece named Marcy Mayer. And she claimed that acorns are edible. And not just edible, but actually a superfood and one of our oldest human foods. And I thought, wait, what? So I reached out, and eventually I got her on the phone, and I started learning more. She told me how she processes acorns and turns them into flour. She told me she saw herself as an acorn ambassador, and I thought, well, that is a new idea. Very cool sounding job. And I realized that I live, under all these oak trees right around my house. And I realized that I had always seen this oak forest around me, this huge protected forest, as an impediment to food production. And I was really excited about the idea that actually it might be a food source, not an impediment to food production. And also sort of had an inkling of a thought like, well, maybe that would make humans part of this place in the same way that the birds were part of the ecosystems that I visited growing up. And this maybe would have been sort of a passing excitement, except for a few other things that happened at the same time. So this brings me to the second thing I want to share with you, which is why these trees are so powerful. So around the same time that I learned that we humans can eat acorns and started talking to this woman, Marcy Mayer, my mom got fascinated by an entomologist named Doug Tallamy. Has anyone here heard of Doug? Okay, yeah. So he's from Pennsylvania, and his big message is that oak trees and some other keystone native plants have this really outsized importance ecologically. A keystone species, if you want to visualize, is as important as a keystone in a Roman arch. So if you pull it out, the whole thing just kind of collapses. And my mom got excited about the bird side of things, because that's what my parents do. Sorry. Tallamy has studied the relationship between plant species and insects, which form the base of our food chain and are a really important food source for birds in particular. And he found that 75% of the insect food required by birds and other wild mammals, or wild animals, is produced by plants in just a few families. So I was really surprised when my mom told me that chickadee parents need more than 6,000 caterpillars to raise a brood of 5 babies. Just let that number sink in. It's incredible. It's a lot of caterpillars, way more than I had ever imagined. And Tallamy has found that some plants are home to way more caterpillars and insects than others. So for instance, maples support 297 species of caterpillars, while yellowwoods, which are a tree in the southeastern US, support none. So you can see there's some pretty big discrepancies. And some plants do very little, some are heavy lifters. And oaks, as Tallamy has put it, are actually the top life support species in almost every North American ecosystem where they occur. They support more than 557 species of caterpillars as a genus, which is way more than any other group of trees. And many cultures historically have called oaks the tree of life, which we're now seeing in this science is for very good reason. They are quite literally the tree of life. So unlike the monocultures of corn and soy that we currently plant, these trees support countless other species. Hazelnuts, hickories, walnuts, beech trees, and chestnuts, all these other nut trees, support fewer caterpillars than oaks, around 130 species each, but they're all still in the top 20 out of woody plants for ecosystem support. So all these nuts, really important ecologically. So when my mom got excited about this and started telling me about how important oak trees and these other nut trees are to birds and wildlife, I started kind of putting the pieces together. I realized that growing our food on these keystone nut trees would basically do the opposite to the living world around us of what our current industrial farming is doing. And I was telling a friend about this, and they said, oh, you've got to come to this talk coming up at our local high school by a guy named Mark Shepard. He's this Midwestern farmer, and he's doing this thing called restoration agriculture. And it's based on creating farms around these keystone nut trees. So I went, and I sat in the back of the classroom and listened to his presentation. And Shepard had a list of all the scientific groups of plants and fungi and animals that we find in typical oak ecosystems, the ones especially that once covered what today is farm country in the Midwest. And this list kind of blew my mind. It had all these things I wanted to eat: chestnuts and huckleberries and cranberries and apples and cherries and plums and peaches and mushrooms and quail and venison. And I don't know about you, but to me that is a list of top-notch human food. Would you rather eat a bowl of soy and corn products, or would you rather eat those foods? So for me, that's a no-brainer. So after Shepard's talk, I went home and I started seeing the woods and ecosystems around me completely differently. I noticed these oaks in the overstory and huckleberries and blueberries underneath. And I realized that despite the fact that I had never seen this forest as anything remotely close to a farm, it was a food producing ecosystem. I was surrounded by food. And I thought, wow, okay, I'm starting to see things a little differently. So I got really into the etymology of words. I love looking back through the history of words. And they told this story of how all over the Northern Hemisphere for thousands of years, these trees have really produced food that is synonymous with a staple food. So a lot of our words for oak in different languages actually mean food or food tree. The name of the tree family Fagaceae, which includes oaks and beeches and chestnuts, comes from the Greek meaning to eat. There's a Gothic word, mats, which leads to our word, or our word mast comes from the Gothic mats, which means food. So there were all these linguistic connections. And I started reading about acorn-eating cultures in Korea and Japan and China and the Mediterranean and Europe and North America, the Middle East, Northern Africa. And then I thought, too bad. We probably still have to produce our food on these industrial farms because there are just so many more of us now than there were when people were relying on these crops. Which brings me to my last point, which is what can happen when we get back into relationship with these trees. So after I learned what ecological powerhouses oaks are, an acorn friend introduced me to a man named Ron Reed. And Ron is an indigenous medicine man and biologist, father, member of the Kuruk tribe in present-day Northern California. And his people have eaten acorns and tended oaks as a staple food since time immemorial. And he and I spent a lot of time during the early pandemic talking on Zoom, talking about acorns. And after every time, I would get really excited and then really skeptical because I had a lot of questions about how much food these trees can actually produce and whether it would be enough to feed the almost 400 million people in North America today. I'd heard my whole life how American farms are feeding the world. And to make a long story short, through getting to know Reed, I learned that this story is a lie. If you look back through our country's history and the stories we tell about food, there's a lot of erasure and falsehoods around Indigenous food production and Indigenous culture in general. But maybe the biggest lie is this idea that as the population expanded here with colonial movement westward, we had to transition from food production based on native ecosystems to European style and then industrial farms. We did not, at least for yield reasons. I get into all the details in the book, but suffice to say that a healthy oak or chestnut or hazelnut ecosystem is capable of producing a lot more food per acre than a monoculture of corn or soy or wheat, which is crazy. So I went really deep down this rabbit hole. I started processing acorns and making my own flour, which we're going to get into a little bit tonight. And as I started working with acorns, I noticed that some trees were a lot more healthy and productive than others. And when I asked Ron about this, he told me a story. He said that in Kuruk culture, every year, his people perform what are called Pikyawish, or world renewal ceremonies. And the point is to create habitat for other species through ceremony. And that surprised me, so I asked, how? How do you create habitat for oaks and hazelnuts and deer through ceremony? I'd always seen oaks as natural and wild, two words that by definition exclude human care and tending. And he said, fire. So every year during the world renewal ceremonies, Kuruk people light prescribed or cultural fires to keep the land healthy. And I didn't really know what to do with this answer, so I went down another rabbit hole. I learned that many oak ecosystems do, in fact, need fire to stay healthy, not just in California, but also in a lot of other places in North America, and that, in fact, because of fire suppression, a lot of oaks in a lot of places, these incredibly important keystone species, are actually having trouble regenerating. I went and got trained in prescribed fire and started going on burns in Oaklands, where I live in Massachusetts. And as I did, Ron kept reminding me that this is our job, to burn trees to keep them healthy. And even as I absorbed this, it sort of kept surprising me because I'd always seen humans as a threat to the natural world. And here Ron was telling me that we are vital to these keystone trees, that in their own right are vital to so many other species. And slowly what I came to understand as I sort of translated everything into my own background of Western science speak is that what Ron was telling me is that not only are oaks and these other trees keystone species, but also so are we. There are a lot of different kinds of keystone species. There are mutualists like bees. There are keystone plants like oaks, predators like sharks. And then there are ecosystem engineers. So these are animals like beavers and elephants and also us. And today we modify ecosystems mostly in negative ways, right? We hear about greenhouse gas emissions, habitat destruction, fertilizer runoff. You all know the list. But historically, our largest role has been to manage and create ecosystems with fire. And as, has anyone here heard of Stephen Pine, a fire historian? Okay, one or two. He calls us the fire animal. And in many places all over North America, and in fact all over the world, our fire and these keystone nut trees have actually been in relationship for thousands of years. So as I close, I want to put in a word for remembering our role on the land as the fire animal and for remembering our longstanding relationship with these nut trees. Where I live on Cape Cod, I've already seen what a thriving ecosystem led by human tending and care can look like in the sea. I know there's also an oyster industry up here. My town where I live on Cape Cod is famous for its oysters. And in addition to producing food for humans, they also clean the water and generally create a healthy watershed. And we can do this on land too. We can be part of the living fabric of our places instead of trying to be separate from them. And we can tend these trees of life and increase biodiversity. We can put carbon back in the ground. We can reverse dead zones. We can produce an abundance of delicious, nutritious food at the same time, and generally be an ecological force for good. So if that idea excites you, I wrote you a whole book full of stories. And it'll be for sale afterwards. But for now, I'd love to take a few questions and then show you how to actually work with some acorns that I have collected and brought to share with you. Does anyone have a question?
And for those questions, you have to hold the talking stick here in the sense of, I would like you to talk into it because your question then will be recorded and it can be heard by everyone, all right?
Go ahead. Well, you have to get the talking stick. Or two talking sticks.
Which species do you work with? All the red oaks and also white oak? Or?
So I brought tonight an easy little visual to show you. Oaks come in two families. Within those families, there are so many different species. I think there are 600 plus in the Northern Hemisphere. So red oak family always has the pointy leaves. White oak family has the rounded leaves. In Maine, I have found that red Quercus rubra, the northern red oak, seems to be the most abundant and common source of acorns. Where I live on Cape Cod, white oak acorns are more abundant and common. They're having a mast year this year. And I work with both. I slightly prefer the northern red oak acorns, so you all are very lucky. You live in the right spot. But I've worked with both. And they both have sort of advantages and disadvantages in terms of processing. Yes?
Microphone's for you. Thank you.
Can you tell me why we're not seeing any acorns around this year?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Where I live, it's a mast year, which is a bumper crop. And oaks and some other nut trees do something called masting. So they will produce an absolutely enormous crop in some years and not in others. And scientists are actually still trying to understand why. There's lots of different theories and no concrete answers. People think that it might have to do with the trees, so they coordinate. So like if none of the trees in your area are producing much, they have coordinated to do that, and you will notice that in other years they coordinate to produce a lot. And one of the theories is that they want to overproduce in some years so that the population of predators, animals that eat the nuts, can't get them all, and then new ones regenerate from the extra acorns. But that if they did that every year steadily, the population of predators would just come up to match the level of acorn production. So, we've been learning a lot over the past decade or so about the ways that trees communicate, and this is one of their strategies, but they haven't told us yet why. So, but yeah, even factoring in the fact that oaks mast, I did factor that into my studies of productivity, and one really cool thing about acorns is that they're very high in tannins, which is both an annoying thing because you have to process them out, and a cool thing because they can last for decades. So in those super productive years, we can collect a lot and see them through the next few years. Yes?
Microphone's for you.
When I think of food plants, I tend to think of plant genetics. I think of intensive fertilizer use and things like that to increase production. Actually, I've never associated that with oaks. Is there any of that going on, or are oaks so well evolved that they don't need any of that to be a highly productive tree, and that therefore we might not need some of those inputs that we have in more industrial agriculture?
Yeah, I would say it kind of depends who you ask. So there are some people who I know of. There's a really cool project run by a man named Russell Wallace, I want to say his last name. It's called Bread Tree Farm. That's in New York. They're doing a lot of work with chestnuts, but they've also established some oak breeding orchards, and they are trying to breed for bigger nuts. I definitely think that there's interesting work that can happen around breeding. And at the same time, oaks already seem very productive and well adapted to a lot of ecosystems. So I think it's both. The short answer. Yeah.
I'm interested in the history of our relationship with fire, and do we have Smokey the Bear to blame for our disconnection now, or our the association with fire as a detrimental impact, or was it before Smokey?
It's really complicated. There was a really big series of huge fires out west in the early 1900s that put a lot of panic into people. But there was also a really complicated relationship in the sense that a lot of indigenous groups have used fire for a really long time in North America. And at first, when European colonizers came over and started also establishing communities, a lot of communities were imitating indigenous practices and burning the woods and burning other areas. And what happened during the early 1900s, it was this real period of scientific racism, and there was this story that emerged about methods of food production and sort of evolved advanced methods versus primitive methods, and fire got pushed into the quote-unquote primitive camp, and that was around the same time that the Smokey the Bear narrative started taking off that fire was bad. And what's really interesting, if you look at the statistics today, we are working so hard to suppress fires, right? And even with that, humans are the leading source of fire all over North America. So even as we try to suppress fire instead of working with it, as we have in the past, we are still the main source of fire. So I think the sooner we can embrace that, and that is starting to happen. Fire ecology has really taken off as a discipline, and there's been a lot of recognition in forestry communities that there does need to be a shift, but it's kind of slow to trickle out from those smaller conversations into the broader public discourse. You hear a lot in California because they're experiencing these catastrophic wildfires, but you don't hear a lot about fire in the East, and fire is just as much a part of our ecosystems here as it is out there. It's just not as dramatic in its presentation, so we don't talk as much about it. Yes?
Microphones for you.
Aside from North America, are there other countries and cultures that are processing acorns and nuts more than we are?
Yes. So Korea processes tons of acorns. They have acorn products that you can readily buy at the store. If you go in a Korean market in the US, they almost all stock acorn starch, which is a really common ingredient in Korean cooking. So if you have ever made latkes and like grated a potato and let them go in the water and then seen the starch settle out, corn starch, acorns have that exact same kind of starch. It looks a tiny bit different. It's brownish instead of white. But they make this like acorn, it's called dotorimuk. It's almost like an acorn jello made out of this starch, which sounds so weird. But then you add a bunch of grated and julienned vegetables and this ginger, soy, sesame dressing. It's delicious. There's acorn starch noodles. There's like a whole gamut of acorn starch creations. There's also some communities in Northern Africa making acorn oil and couscous out of acorn. So there are some pretty active communities more in Asia and Northern Africa. And then, of course, in the West, in present-day California and the Northwest, there are a lot of indigenous nations who have a really long history of processing acorns into flour. And there's different species that they're working with out there than what we're working with here. Some of them are a lot easier to leach the tannins out of, so they have a different relationship with that food, I think, because of that. But yes, still very much alive and active in some of these communities. Yeah, in the stripes.
Thank you. Yeah, kind of on that topic, I'm really curious about the food system and kind of scalability piece that you mentioned earlier, and was also just wondering, like, imagining that we are in the future and we are stewarding and tending forests of trees to feed ourselves, what impact would that also have on other, animals, creatures in the ecosystem? Because I'm thinking about the chickadees needing 6,000 caterpillars. So, like, do squirrels need 6,000 acorns, and how would we disrupt or not? So can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I got really obsessed with the yield numbers for like 3 years. I spent a very long time on the yield numbers. And I ended up talking a lot with an agronomist named Ricardo Salvador. He's a really interesting guy, works with the Union of Concerned Scientists. And he reminded me that yield is a ratio, right? So when we are measuring the yield from, say, a cornfield in the Midwest, we are only measuring the land where that corn is growing. We're not measuring the land that it took to get the fuel there to run the machinery. We're not measuring the land that it took to create the tractor to mine those minerals. We're not measuring the land that it took to create the fertilizer. We're not measuring the land that it took to create the seed. So we're not actually measuring accurately yield, because yield is what you get out for what you put in. And when you start looking at those numbers, these polycultures with a diversity of species are always more productive every time. And so I think right now we have this mindset where we're going to use a certain amount of land for agriculture, and then we're going to protect other land for wildlife. And I think that what we could do instead is maybe be producing food on more land, but be doing it in a very different way, where we are also creating more habitat for other species. It's almost impossible to give you like an exact number of what that would look like, but when we shift our mindset around it to the fact that producing food can actually be ecologically good, then a lot of possibilities open up. And there are a lot of numbers in the book if you're into numbers. So I'm going to take a couple more, and I'm happy to take more after, but we will do a little processing first in the back.
Are you going to ask? No. This guy would like to know what it is the fire does that helps the trees.
Such a good question. Okay, so oaks really like the middle stage of something that's called succession, and that's kind of a big, boring word. But what that means is, like, if you clear a field, weeds will grow in it, right? And then maybe shrubs will grow in it, and then big trees will grow in it. And so if we don't put fire in the forest, these trees that come after oaks in those stages that really like shady, dark areas, they will grow, and then the oaks will try to grow, and they'll be like, there's not enough sun, I can't grow here. So when we burn the forest, it does a few things. It helps create the forest openness that the oaks like in order to have babies and come back. It also takes everything that's on the ground and it recycles those nutrients really quickly back into the soil, so it gives them kind of a fertilizer boost. It helps control the water cycle in places like California, where when you have too many trees on the land, you actually get more prone to drought and catastrophic wildfires. So if you do prescribed burns, it prevents that from happening. It can control pests and pathogens. So we might find today when we open some acorns, some little cool bugs known as acorn weevils. And the smoke from fires, when it's timed correctly, can actually interrupt that life cycle. So just like you would spray a pesticide, maybe to interrupt a pest life cycle, you can do that with fire. And one other really cool thing that fire does is every fire creates some sort of char matter, right, and some ash. And that char matter builds up in the soil year after year after year. And when we look at these incredibly rich soils, they have been created by fire. So the mollisols in the Midwest, also places like Argentina, mollisols all over the world, have been created through repeated fires. And that fertility is a type of fertility that doesn't go away. It's not like adding compost to your soil and then you get this nutrient boost and then it's gone. It actually creates what I kind of think of as like affordable housing for essential soil workers. So like it makes this environment where they want to show up and hang out, and then there's more nutrients. And plus, it's really fun to light things on fire. So that's part of it. I'm going to take one more over here.
Thank you for waiting for the microphones. We appreciate that.
Yeah, I have another question about scalability. What future do you envision in which these acorn products are available to folks of varying varieties of land access, so folks who live in cities and towns and of different income levels, while not concentrating profits from acorn products in hands of agro-industry?
Yeah, so I think that if we are able to scale this in a regional way as opposed to a national way, I think guessing that a lot of people here have experimented with producing some of your own food and processing some of your own food, and you find out pretty quickly that it's time consuming when you try to do everything on your own. That scale isn't that viable, but at the same time, we don't want to go all the way to the scale that we're at now, because we've seen how many problems that creates and how many vulnerabilities in our food system. So I personally believe that like a regional level is a really appropriate level to try to scale this to. And there are some really interesting things happening right now with commons-based farmland approaches. And a lot of the people who are early adopters of those systems are actually tree people, because one of the first hurdles that you encounter if you're trying to do tree crops is like you can't have a 1 to 3 year lease on your land and be successful. You really need a much longer term lease and a much longer term vision. I was recently at the Northern Nut Growers Association conference in the Midwest, and there was a lot of talk there about the same question: scalability, land transfers, land tenure, and a lot of talk of moving. There's a new land trust called the Farmers Land Trust that's just coming out. You probably heard of the Agrarian Commons if you're interested in this type of stuff, but a lot of movement toward like, how do we make decisions as a community to secure land for some of these perennial regenerative crops, so that we're not, someone doesn't plant these amazing genetics, the trees grow for 50 years, they all get cut down, you're starting over. So I think those are really important questions, and I think that the only way to answer them is in community. I think a lot about what this looks like in the community where I live now in terms of the ocean. We are one of the oldest wild harvest oyster industries, I think one of the only continual wild harvest oyster industries in the East. And I have lots of friends who are wild pickers. They go out, they pick oysters. That's their job. That's how they make a living. And they are going and picking up a wild product and bringing it back and selling it to a co-op that everyone in the community has come together to form. So I think that we've seen some really successful models like black walnuts, Hammond's black walnuts. They have these like different processing centers throughout a lot of Appalachia, and people can bring in those wild nuts and they have the processing equipment. So yeah, I hope that answers things a bit, but I think some sort of communal, regional type scale looks really promising for these types of crops. I am happy to take more questions. I could stand here all night and talk about acorns, but I'm guessing some of you want to actually get your hands on some, and I know some people have kids here. So not everyone has to get up, but if anyone wants to get up and come up here and start looking at some acorns, we are going to put some acorns. There's going to be a few options. Some people could crack some acorns with rocks. And there's also, so I just spent some time in Switzerland working with a group on traditional chestnut processing. And I got a lot of ideas from their chestnut processing for acorn processing. And one thing that they do is they put dried chestnuts in a long, skinny sack, and they whack it against a piece of wood. And it is very fun and very satisfying. And it also works with acorns. So we're going to talk about a few different methods, and if anyone wants to come up here and be kind of like a hands-on demonstrator, come on up. There can't really be too many, so don't be shy. And one thing that I'm going to tell everybody as we get started, so in terms of the life cycle of red oak family acorns and white oak family acorns, you can pass these around if you want. White oak family acorns germinate right away in the fall. So you'll notice they've already started sprouting. I just picked these up this morning after the rain. They immediately started germinating. Red oak acorns don't germinate till the spring. So again, in Maine, you have a bit of an advantage because you can be a little slower at picking up your acorns and they won't have already germinated. They're still okay to crack and eat, but they're not quite as good as if they haven't started germinating. All right, so do you want to be my first volunteer? No, it's okay. You don't have to be. So I am going to demonstrate. So in the region of Switzerland where I was, this area called Regalia, they have relied on chestnuts as a staple food for more than 2,000 years. They have got their processing dialed in. They've got traditional techniques. And what they start with is a bunch of fresh chestnuts. They dry them in these special huts where they keep a fire lit day and night for 6 weeks and smoke them and dry them. It's pretty incredible. And then, well, it's only once in the morning and once at night. So even though it sounds hard, they've got it like, it's kind of like no-knead bread. They've got it. And then they fill up a pillowcase like this, but it's like a linen sack. It's a bit longer. And they say that you need to do 40 whacks to break open your bag of chestnuts. So they just go like this 40 times. And anyone who wants to try it, I have some pillowcases here. You can give it a try. And then we also have another method that people use that is sort of tedious and not my favorite, is to just crack them open with a rock. But people can also try that. I think for that, I'm going to lay down one of these pillowcases on this table here so that you're not hitting the table. But you can try that. And then once we get a few acorns open, and traditionally a lot of acorn winnowing has been done with baskets. So you would take, I was able to do it with chestnuts in Switzerland. You sort of toss them up in the air like this, and the heavy nuts fall to the back and the light shells fall to the front, and then you shake the basket, the shells fall out, and you continue that movement. I have not yet been able to find the right basket. I have a picture of it. I'm going to either make it or find it. So we're not going to be able to do that step that way. We're going to have to pick out some of the acorn nut meats with our hands. But then we're going to put them in this Vitamix and whiz them into a slurry, basically. And then I'm going to show you a couple different ways to get the tannins out. So has anyone here ever eaten an olive straight off the tree? Yeah, what did it taste like? Unedible. Yeah, it's disgusting, right? That has not stopped us from making olives a worldwide staple crop. But they have the same bitter chemicals in them that acorns have. So that's a tannin, what you taste in that olive. These acorns also have tannins. It's what makes them last forever. Once they dried, they can last for decades. But we have to get them out, and they're water soluble. So that's why we're going to process them in some water. And then I'm going to show you 2 ways to get those tannins out. So let's do some acorn cracking if anyone feels inclined. We can have some crackers and then also some people to pick out some of the nut meats from what we've cracked open.
Elspeth, I'll just add that we also have tools from the Library of Things that any of these patrons could borrow so they don't have to whack with a pillow if they didn't want to.
Do you have a Dave built?
Yes.
Yes.
We also have different winnowing equipment.
Amazing.
Well.
So your tool library is way ahead of my personal tool library. But I do have friends that have a Dave built, and that is an awesome hand crank contraption by this family in Texas that has learned how to crack like every type of nut. And they're very cool, and I would highly recommend checking it out of the tool library, unless you really like whacking things. So this is, we're going to do the red oak acorns. You can look at the white oak acorns, but they're not dry. These ones are still wet. And one thing that you'll learn really quickly with acorn processing is that trying to crack open wet acorns is not a good plan. They get stuck to the outside. It's going to take way longer, whereas the dried ones come right out.
How long do you dry them, or how do you dry them?
So I usually just put them in a basket near my wood stove if we've started the wood stove. If we haven't, I sometimes just throw the bag of them in the freezer until we do start the wood stove because I don't have like a big dehydrator.
Okay. They're not ready when you just pick them up in the fall.
They're not usually ready because it's usually like now where it just rained a bunch and yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, go ahead if you want to. And then if anyone else wants to sort good ones into here, you can. The ground might be better. Yeah.
The ground, I would go for.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to be harder than this because this is just a piece of plywood.
Go for it. All right, so if people want to either gather around or sit back down, I just want to make sure everyone can see, so maybe we should sit.
All right, everyone, if we can sit back down for a moment, we want to see the final part of this. I believe it's the acorn slurry section.
We're going to do 2 different things, and they're both going to be really quick. So I know some people are starting to need to head out, but we'll be speedy. I want to show you 2 different ways of getting the tannins out, because this is where a lot of people get hung up. You know, they can figure out the cracking. There's a lot of different methods, including, it sounds like, really efficient, effective tools that are available at this very library, which is very exciting. But then you have to get the tannins out, right? So they're not going to be delicious to eat until we get these tannins out. So what I'm going to do, one way to get the tannins out is just with water. And then another way involves using lye. So some people, when I say that, make a terrible face. But lye is actually used in a lot of traditional food processing. So corn, if you've heard of nixtamalizing corn, which is an indigenous processing technique in the Americas, it frees up the B vitamins, which is really important if you're going to be eating corn as a staple food. If you don't do that, you can get really sick and actually die if you're relying on corn as a staple food and you're not doing that traditional nixtamalization. And so that's done with lye. Olives, table olives that we all eat are also processed with lye. So while it is slightly dangerous while you're doing it, it is very safe in terms of food consumption. So we are going to do the lye first because it's really fun to watch. So this is just the acorns that you guys just opened right here in this mason jar. This is food grade lye, and you can see it says on it, poison, death, burn you, that's so that no one in my family gets confused about the lye. I always wear gloves when I do this. There's a really cool forager named Samuel Thayer. I would guess that this library has a lot of his books. He's written some really amazing foraging guides, and he And I talked a lot for my book, and he's done a lot of, oh wow, this lye has maybe been in the basement for too long, but I think it's still gonna do the job. He's probably the person who I know who's experimented the most with acorn processing, and one of the ways that he does process acorns a lot is with lye. So lye actually forms, in a way that I'm not going to try to explain scientifically, a chemical bond with the tannins where they come out basically instantly. So we are going to stir this in. I'm going to get a little more after this. And you can see, so those are tannins. I guess I'm not even going to need a little more. And they are immediately bonding with that lye and the water, and they're just precipitating right out. So when you're trying to get tannins out fast, lye is a great way to do that. And it depends who you ask. I don't think it affects the flavor very much. Some people say they really notice it. The feedback on that seems to really vary. But basically, oh, did you have a question?
Well, I'm just curious. So what if you use the lye and then you have the water that's infused with this lye? What is the water?
We're going to get rid of that water, yeah. So what you would do is put this in a strainer or a colander, strain out the water, run cold water over it, and then you would do that several times, put it back in the jar for a few hours, come back, see if the water looks dark again or if it looks clear, and then just make sure you get to the stage where you can put water on the acorns, leave it for a few hours, and it looks clear. If you've gotten to that stage, yeah, well, it's kind of like kneading bread. Like, just got to wait a minute, but you're not really doing anything while you wait. So this is one way of doing things. Yeah?
Is it okay then to pour the lye water right down the drain, or do you have to do anything?
That is a good question. I don't, because I have a septic system where I live. I just go and I pour it in the designated very back bushes. But if you're on town water, it's something that or town sewer, I would look it up. It might depend where you live. It's not great for your septic system.
So the tannins don't neutralize it or anything?
Sadly, no. And that's why you wear gloves, because that water if it gets on your skin, it's not a good plan. But very safe to eat once you've rinsed it. The way that I like to do it is not this way, because I don't know. I don't think it's necessary unless you're in like a really big hurry. So this is a Vitamix. I've tried other blenders, and I don't want to do an ad for Vitamix, but they really just don't do this particular job very well. So I would recommend using something like this. And you basically start with some water, some acorns. I am noticing, which you might notice, acorn shells tend to float. So if you've done not the best job sorting and you don't want to eat acorn shells, I would pull those out. But that's a helpful part of the water. And then
Did we get a C minus?
your grade is not amazing. No, so then you do this. And how long you go depends on how fine you want to make your acorn particles. So some people want a really fine flour. Some people, similar to like a more stone ground cornmeal, want a little bit more chunky. I tend to want it to be pretty fine. You can already see, so this cloudy stuff is the starch that's in the water. That's the color that it is. And you can go to a Korean grocery store, even like Korean grocers online, and you can buy the acorn starch and experiment with it. It's really fun. You can also make it yourself. So I'm going to go a little more. So one thing about getting the tannins out is the more surface area, the bigger surface area to volume ratio, like the more of the structure of the acorn you expose, the faster the tannins are going to come out, because the water can touch every part of it. So then what I like to do is, has anyone ever interacted with the Maine Local Living School in Temple, Maine? Really cool place. I learned this technique from them, and they have a really cool setup so this is just a colander with a very old stained dish towel in it, and I pour it in here. Right now, I'm not in my sink, if I was in my sink, I wouldn't need this pot underneath it, but I'm trying not to ruin the library's belongings. And you'll see a lot of this got stuck, but you would get all of it out. And then people can come back up if they want. You can see that the water is just filtering slowly through this cloth. And there's enough water. You want to come see? Come see. There's enough water in here that the acorn meal is currently below the water. And I learned from them to put a little wooden spoon, and then I just leave the water of my faucet dripping, like barely going. And that means the water is just continually staying at this level, circulating out, and that removes the tannins really fast. So some people will put acorns in a jar without lye, and they'll change the water every day, and you check on it every day, and that takes weeks, and is kind of time consuming and annoying in my opinion. It can work for some people. Other people will put a cheesecloth bag of acorns in their toilet tank. That actually is, I think Hazel was saying, she's heard that. It is a great method because there is continually flushing new clean water, and it is not, even though it sounds gross, it's actually not gross. It's in the clean water part of the toilet. My family, I don't think would ever eat anything that I made in the toilet, so I also don't love that technique. But this works really well, and it's really easy. And the ideal water temperature, which they have really dialed in at Maine Local Living School because they have this solar hot water tank, and they're just letting warm, like lukewarm, not super cold, not super hot. So heat destroys the starch enzyme in the acorns, so they won't have that thickening property. You can still make bread, you can still make lots of stuff. It just won't, like, you couldn't stir it into a pudding to thicken a pudding without that starch. So a lot of people, for that reason, prefer cold processing. But lukewarm seems to work faster without destroying the starch. So I just leave a tiny bit of lukewarm water trickling, and when I come back a few hours later and I taste the acorn meal, if people want to taste it now, you're welcome to. It is bitter. It does not taste good. And after a few hours, you can taste it again, and the bitterness is gone. And then you have a flour that either you can dehydrate and work with, or like if you're mixing it into a sourdough or a bread or something, a lot of those recipes call for liquid. So I would just squeeze it out in the cloth, get as much liquid out as possible, and use it wet so you can skip that step. You can also throw it in, squeeze it out and throw it in the freezer. I'm lazy, so I like to skip that step whenever I can. But those are some basics of acorn processing. So I think I'm gonna leave it there. I have books for sale. I'm happy to stay after and chat with anyone who has more questions. But thank you all for coming.